Welcome back, family, to Black House Live's book lecture series. We are still discussing Dr. Amos Wilson's Blueprint for Black Power. In the last two lectures, we were discussing the ways in which the African American culture and personality has been socialized, specifically for America's economic and political interests. In the next two chapters, we will juxtapose the socialization of African American culture and personality with the socialization process, right, of the white ruling elite's collective consciousness that not only allows for the dominance over black society, but it allows for the ruling and the dominance of the governmental decision-making process. And so we're going to be discussing both of those two things, right? The ways in which the white socialization process, the collective white consciousness, has dominated the African American community in America as well as the world over, as well as dominate the governmental decision making process in America and internationally as well. And so let's jump right into it. Social classes and class conflict. Dr. Wilson, as well as Dr. Chancellor Williams in The Destruction of Black Civilization, reminded us in lectures 2 and 3 that white ideologies will no longer serve us going forward, right? Dr. Wilson argued that all borrowed ideologies and frameworks need to be Africanized in order for them to meet the realities and to be able to speak to the current issues that African people find themselves in, right? These ideologies and frameworks have to be adapted to meet those realities. And yet, here he is arguing the all too familiar Marxian critique of capitalism, in that all complex societies are characterized by the uneven distribution of wealth and income, prestige, privilege, authority, and power. He argues that these uneven distributions and differences provide the basis for the ranking of these groups and individuals according to class and other measures of inferiority and superiority. I will show really soon that there's no contradiction, right, between Wilson's argument that, white ideologies have to be adapted or Africanized in order to meet our realities, right, while simultaneously using Marxist critique of capitalism. So let's keep going. Dr. Wilson defines social class as individuals who occupy a broadly similar category or ranking, right, that stratifies, separates them in a particular social system. And so you will remember in previous lectures, I stated that I'm a historian. I taught world history. And in that teaching, in times, folks were categorized as aristocrats. And if you were an aristocrat, you were of a certain class, right, that separated you from, let's say, the merchants, right? These were folks who either operated some type of storefront, they bought and sold goods, they traded them far and wide. And that class of merchants distinguished them from the aristocrats, or let's say the peasants. And so those were categories and rankings that separated folks in a particular social system. Dr. Wilson continues, he says a social class may be functionally defined. So it may, the social class may define folks in terms of their division of labor, in terms of the work that folks do. They were separated. So historically, you had folks who were classified as soldiers, or some folks were classified as farmers, and others were classified as politicians. Those names, like locksmiths and blacksmiths, the names, right, identified you by the particular type of work that you did, right? And so you had classes of laborers, different classes of laborers. According to Dr. Wilson, social class can also be defined based on the outcomes of competing classes, right? You can define class based on the outcomes of these competing haves and have-nots, all right? So that's another way that we can define social class. According to Dr. Wilson, class conflict may not result from the mere inequality of distribution of material and social resources, power, prestige, right? All individuals may, to a significant degree, he argues, share and accept an ideology, which explains and justifies the distribution of power and reward in the society. So for Dr. Wilson, class conflict does not automatically happen just because there is an uneven distribution of resources. In certain societies, right, those classes of people may have come to accept, they have legitimized the distribution of those resources and how they are allocated, how folks are rewarded, right? And so they've legitimized that. And so there may not necessarily be class conflict. Here's Wilson's point of departure from Marx. For Marx and his followers, class conflict was an inevitable clash between the laborer and the exploiters of labor, right? And so Wilson argues that this is not always true. He argues that members may, to a significant degree, share and accept an ideology which explains, justifies, and rationalizes the current situation. And so many folks can argue that lower class African Americans and other lower class groups of people in America, but due to the fact that they don't rebel against the current economic system, they don't rebel against the current political system, we have legitimized this current system. And so there hasn't been the type of class conflict that Marx and many others have predicted would happen, because many of the working class, right, and lumped proletarian individuals in society have not risen up, right, and have not rebelled against society in the ways in which Marx claimed that they would. And Dr. Amos Wilson is saying that to a large degree, many individuals have come to accept the justifications and the rationalizations of the current, right, economies that they live in, the current labor boundaries that have been set up. They've accepted them for what they are. For Wilson's point of departure is that class conflict is a result of the have-nots obtaining a collective consciousness that they've collectively been wronged as a class, and that the gain was at their expense. And so for Dr. Wilson, class conflict is a byproduct of the have-nots recognizing and developing consciousness. They recognize that something has happened to them as a group. And so conflict can only arise, right, when folks are conscious of themselves as a particular class. And currently, we have folks operating in society as individuals, right, who do not see themselves as a part of a collective. Thus, they have no idea that they're being wronged or aggressed upon. And so class conflict, according to Dr. Wilson, is a byproduct of class consciousness, right? And this class recognizes that the actions of a dominant group threatens their interests and threatens their reality. According to Dr. Wilson, the United States unevenly distributes income, property, authority, prestige, and power according to race and ethnicity. Dr. Wilson argues that the white corporate class possesses and controls the most valued properties with the highest incomes, right? That from that gives them the most power and prestige. And so they're motivated by and organized to realize their desires to consolidate their positions, right? Both nationally and internationally. Dr. Wilson argues that historically the white corporate elite has used the government and its social system to its own interests. Citing the 1991 census, white households were 10 times wealthier than the typical black household. The census went on to show that while black inner cities experienced declines in income, business executives were earning 120 times the average worker by the mid-1970s. Just to show how ridiculous this trend has grown since the publishing of this book, MSNBC reported in 2021 that according to the Economic Policy Institute, the EPI estimates that CEO compensation has grown 1,322%. I'm going to say that number again, 1,322% since 1978, while typical worker compensation has risen just 18%. In 2020, CEOs of the top 350 firms in the US made $24.2 million on average, which is 351 times more than a typical worker, right? So since the publishing of this book, this trend has continued, right? In that while the African American community is seeing decreases, right, in income, right? Black families are seeing decreases in income. CEOs, right, and white elite companies are having extreme prosperity. Dr. Wilson reminds us that the increasing wealth of the wealthiest families in America is not merely the result of salary and earning increases, but is also the result of federal entitlement spending, such as federal benefit payments to individuals. And so Wilson argues that the elite classes are looting the nation's treasury, pillaging its resources, and mugging its workers and poorer classes. And yet, the paradox is that the poor classes, including Black Americans, seem to approve their exploitation, right? We seem to approve our exploitation by the reigning elite when judged by the fact that we can continue to repeatedly vote these folks into office, right? Nationally, state, and in these local regimes. And so, as we were talking earlier, class conflict is not an inevitable thing because most folks have come to legitimize these systems, right? And if there was a problem with these systems, we'd see that conflict arise in society, but we don't see these class conflicts happen that often. And so as a result, one can only explain the lack of conflict is because certain classes have not developed that consciousness to see themselves as classes, right? Dr. Wilson argued that in previous chapters that we legitimize white authority by blindly obeying white racist policies that do not serve our interests, and it maintains our domination. The white elite power structure. Dr. Wilson argues that white political and economic domination is a result of white power organizing itself as an exclusive nation within its own political system. Central government, they have their own economic system, right? And they have their own social and class structure. And so Wilson goes on to argue that this exclusive nation of whites, they maintain their own military establishments and means of making war, right? They have a national guard and police force. Through these armed services, it seeks to maintain order in their national and international interests, right? As a community, Black folks and Africans have not organized themselves exclusively as a nation. We have not developed our own political systems. We have not developed our own central government. We have not developed our own economic system, right? We erroneously believe that we are a part of the American political system, the American government system, the American economic system. And what Dr. Wilson will get us to see in this chapter and the next two chapters, right, is that the current political system, the current economic system that we exist in is a segmented one, right? It is a dual one. It is one that exists for white folks and it is a one that exists for everybody else. And African American people do not get to participate in this white exclusive political economic system. Dr. Wilson argues that we erroneously identify this exclusive white nation as synonymously with the United States as a whole, and with both its white and non-white citizens, right? Non-white folks are not citizens in America. It is just that clear. America has developed citizenship for white land-owning elites. And this was very much the same thing in Greece, right? It was very much the same thing in Rome. And the United States considers itself patterned after those earlier civilizations. And they have taken that same mindset and mantra as well. Unless you are a white land-owning elite, this government isn't really for you. Wilson argues that this white nation within a nation controls entry and naturalization of outsiders within its bounds, and especially as it pertains to Black America. When America allows white immigrants over to this country, allow Europeans from other nations over to this country, they got a chance to decide who would be a part of the white body politic of this country, right? Which European nations could be considered white and who wouldn't be considered white, right? And African folks, by and large, have been excluded from that naturalization process. Now, there are ethnic groups that come over to this country that organize themselves and economically are able to produce a significant amount of wealth, right? And so because of that, are able to participate in some degree in this economic and political process. All right. And we do have to acknowledge that, and Dr. Wilson acknowledges that to a certain degree. The white elite power structure. Dr. Wilson argues that historically the white nation has strategically developed a position where they get to decide who can be classified as white and who cannot. We just got done discussing that. Wilson argues that, Black Americans have been effectively excluded from participating in this exclusive white nation, with the exception of a few token Black men and women. Wilson poses the challenge to Black Americans that, given our wholesale exclusion from American society, why do we consider ourselves loyal citizens to a country that shuns us? Why do we continue to try to fight for a citizenship, right? And the trinkets of citizenship in this country when we are not allowed to participate as full-blown citizens in the society, right? That is something that we're going to have to continue to reconcile. We're going to have to reckon with that question here in the near future. Dr. Wilson argues that groups that have been able to achieve substantial economic surplus with cohesive economic political organization and distinctive group consciousness and identity can and does exert power and influence beyond their actual numbers in the general population. In Chapter 14, Economics and Race, Wilson provides several examples of this, and we'll discuss that further when we get into Chapter 14. He provides great examples of ethnic groups in America who have been able to produce their own economies, who have been able to produce their own labor forces and things of that nature, right? And argues that they serve as great orientations for the African American community to model, right? But by and large, those groups that are unable to do this, and in order for white ruling elite power to be the way that it is, it cannot have 10, 12, 14 other competing ethnic groups or even white European groups, right? Otherwise, their power would be threatened. And so in order for them to dominate, it has to be this way, where other groups do not have a collective consciousness. They do not have a class consciousness, right, that allow them to work for and exert their own economic and political interests in the same ways. Dr. Wilson argues that this white elite power has been developed as a result of the African American community's failure to realize and exert its full power and influence to gain its complete liberation, independence, prosperity, and self-respect, right? We will constantly and often talk about the systemic barriers that prevent African Americans, right, from being able to achieve this liberation. But we also have to hold that mirror up to ourselves and talk about the things that we have done, the agency that we play, right, and why we are not where we need to be. And so until we develop this collective consciousness, right, of seeing ourselves as a particular class, until we start to work for our own class interests, right, we will continue to be dominated in this way. We've discussed in our last two lectures in Chapter 3 and 6 that the African American culture and personality collectively has been socialized to care for and protect others' interests instead of their own. Dr. Wilson calls for the organization of Black power the world over as a nation-state organization to counter that of the white American nation-state, or as a tribal state. Given our political economic exclusion, why have we not utilized either of these vehicles to express our economic liberation, to organize ourselves as an exclusive nation, right, where we are developing and organizing our own political structures, our own economic structures, our own sense of employment, right? We're moving in that vein, right? Or organizing ourselves in terms of a tribal state, again, where we are moving and operating for the defense and protection of ourselves. We are not a part of the American white economy. We are excluded from that. And until we understand that, we are going to, again, continue to be dominated. During the Jim Crow era, Black communities were forced to create an exclusive Black economy that thrived. We had to recreate that spirit again. We need to recreate that spirit again wherever the African is concentrated, right? We have the examples, right, during Jim Crow, where we could not participate in the white economy. And as a result of that, we developed our own exclusive black economies. Dr. Wilson contends, and I think we know this, that in order for white racial and ruling class dominance to continue to exist, blacks and other oppressed groups have to represent a diffused tribal identity. We have to continue to work for the interests of other people. We have to, our personalities have to be other directed, right? And there has to be a propaganda campaign. There has to be a concerted outward force that is focused on keeping African American people in this particular position as well, right? So that white dominance can continue. In order for white Americans to continue to reign politically and economically supreme, it requires a white racist and white ruling class consciousness. White racism unites all whites around a sense of race awareness and white consciousness. Most importantly, this awareness reflects the feeling that while all members of the race do not all share the same class interests, they perceive themselves as one in their struggles against opposing races and groups. We talked about the myth of individualism in previous lectures. The white ruling elite is telling all other classes and groups of people to compete against one another, while the white ruling elite is developing a class consciousness, developing a white awareness for all classes of white people that says, despite the fact that you may not share the same class interests, this struggle is for all of us. The African American community will have to develop a similar type of consciousness, right? For the next two chapters, this chapter 7, chapter 8, and chapter 12 are going to focus a lot on the white ruling elite's collective consciousness to show as an example, as a result of the black political and economic consciousness being destabilized, being neutralized, what this white power has been able to do, right? And the work that is yet to be done within our community. So we're going to be able to look at that collective white consciousness and see how it dominates, right, in the governmental decision-making process, and how it dominates in the black African-American community. Wilson defines class consciousness as the belief that all members of one social class have similar economic and political interests and are promoted through common interests. So again, whether you are a part of the upper, middle, or lower class as a white person, you recognize that the interests of the group, it is what is most important. Dr. Wilson argues that lower classes, specifically black lower classes, their weakness of class and race consciousness are to a great extent the deliberate result of an ongoing aggressive ideological campaign against such consciousness, right? Because black folks do not see themselves as a collective, right? We cannot effectively develop a means of defending ourselves against this ideological propaganda campaign. We have bought into the myth of individualism, right, which allows us to continue to be dominated. Meanwhile, the white ruling elite benefits and maintains its dominance as a collective class from the class unconsciousness of the lower classes. Because the lower classes do not understand themselves to be a part of a group, right? They are effectively, right, and disproportionately discriminated against. Wilson argues that this class unconsciousness is a deliberate ideological campaign led by the white male elite. There are millions and billions of dollars that are put and pumped into our media, right? That is pumped into the educational programs and training programs that preaches the ideology of individualism, that promises the rewards and spoils of money and wealth, right? If folks continue to go at this alone. And so it is this pattern, it is these patterns that allow this white dominance to continue. The white business class. Wilson argues that the white businessman represents the most class-conscious group in America. He argues that they are more organized, easily mobilized, right? They possess more facilities for communication. They are more like-minded in standing together in the defense of their privileges. These are the behaviors of a class-conscious group. And so according to Dr. Wilson, the businessman, the white businessman, is the most class-conscious group in America. These white businessmen have effectively allied with other white elite interest groups whose ownership and control of the most influential political and economic institutions define the basis of judgment, defines attitudes and behaviors for the white lower classes and Black American of all classes. This white ruling elite, they have aligned with some of the most influential economic and political institutions. They get to partner with the decision makers, the policy makers, the lawmakers, the policies that are going to go into the educational school systems. They have aligned with this interest, and they get a chance to set these policies, and they get to dictate the trajectory of these interests at the expense of all other people. White business power has been able to effectively maintain and exploit their white race class status to foster the class loyalties necessary to keep this system functioning, while simultaneously structuring the conditions of socialization experiences of Blacks and poors, which destabilizes and destroys their race and class consciousness, their loyalties and cohesions. We will discuss this explicitly in chapters 8 and chapter 12, right? But it is important for us to understand, right, that Black folks and lower classes of white folks did not get in the position that they are in solely because of their own agency, but that there is a concerted effort that goes on a daily effort, right, to keep oppressed people in the positions that they are in. Wilson argues that the absence of Black competing images, symbols, and organization, Black labor unions, Black organized labor, grassroots labor protests, proud and loud, the absence of these symbols, the absence of this kind of energy and behavior from working class sources allows the United States white capitalist culture to remain unchallenged, right? It also prevents the emergence of a competing class, right, and race consciousness. This is what is needed in order to destroy this white supremacist economic and political system. We need competing class consciousness, right? We need competing class conscious ideas and behaviors on the table. And without it, it sustains the impression that the class and race interests are harmonious with the needs of most people and that they're currently being satisfied. And we know that this is just not the case. We know this is not the case. Without the class conflict, we legitimize white supremacy, right? Without conflict between the races, and we see it often, right, which is kind of meted down from the police onto Black and brown bodies, and then we want to talk about race relations in America. But until we have the type of race conflict and the class conflict that happens in society, until we see the race conscious and the class conscious in society challenge white supremacy, right, the status quo will remain. Preparing for power. We think that the creating and molding of the white race consciousness just happens around the dinner table or at Klan rallies, right? But Wilson argues that one of the places the white socialization process is nurtured is in the white educational establishments. Wilson argues that it is in the early childhood, primary, and secondary educational establishments, as well as in the undergraduate and graduate and postgraduate institutions, attended almost exclusively or predominantly by members of the ruling elite, where they learn the roles and behaviors and social abilities which prepare them to wield social power. We talked about the socialization process. We talked about the identification process, right? And it is in these exclusively white early childhood and pre-K, right, and boarding school places where white children are socialized for white supremacy and white power. They are socialized for the jobs and the positions that they are going to take. They are socialized to identify with the white symbols, right? The white phrases, the white handshakes that are going to get them into the places to become the gatekeepers, right, of this society. And yet we as black people continue to just foolishly send our children to these schools hoping that they get a job, a good paying job one day, right? That's going to take care of my baby, take care of my kids. And that's not enough. That's just simply not enough. Dr. Wilson argues that this distinctive education continues through private elementary schools, boarding schools, and a handful of heavily endowed private schools and universities like Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. Like education at these institutions is not necessarily superior to that of lesser prestigious or public institutions, and is often inferior to the latter relative to the development of technical abilities, right? We want to send our children to a lot of these selective schools, even though we know that these may not be the right fit for our children, right? Yet acceptance into these schools is tantamount to acceptance into an exclusive private club where shared attitudes, beliefs, lives, and a sense of character and collective identity are forged. It is important for white children, for white folks to have the names of these schools and institutions on their resumes, because it signals to the other gatekeepers within these white institutions and white businesses that you have been properly socialized. And without these, the names of these schools, these educational establishments on your resume, we cannot say with any level of fidelity that you have been properly socialized within the system. Education at these institutions is not necessarily superior to that of lesser prestigious public institutions. It's often inferior to these trade schools. These folks walking out of Harvard and Yale and Princeton are no better prepared, right, to lead the world than folks coming out of state schools. And yet we know folks that are coming out with trades and skills are making as much money as a lot of these Ivy League folks, right? Dr. Wilson argues that the upper class schooling provides the members of that class with rationales and justifications for socioeconomic inequality and aids them in the acquisition of styles of behavior and social relations that legitimate unequal relationships, prerogatives, and privileges. These white students learn the narratives, the rationales, and the justification for how to talk about inequality, how not to be sad for their wealth and their privilege. They worked hard for it. While everybody else were running around as the offspring of crack mothers and crack fathers, right? Everybody else was off, right, becoming, Fortune 500 leaders. And Wilson has said, we have to challenge that. We got to challenge that ridiculous ideology. But it is at these educational establishments where white folks will develop these rationales and justifications for inequality, how to explain away this inequality. According to Dr. Wilson, the preservation of privilege requires the exercise of power, and those who exercise it cannot be squirmish about the injuries that will ensue from this class conflict. We got to get this money and this wealth by any means necessary, no matter who we got to step on to get it, right? They're just collateral damage. Much like the educational establishments that we just discussed, social clubs, Dr. Wilson argues that the upper class private social clubs are the arenas where class members develop the attitudes of prideful exclusiveness. This is where they learn about their white-only status. This is where the development of white spaces happen, right? Where white communities happen. According to Dr. Wilson, the white ruling elite, those who possess income-producing corporate property rather than income-consuming personal use property, creates and maintains the political economic weakness and disarray of Black America in the lower classes by using a broad variety of methods. Two of these means by which this end is accomplished includes the infusing of blacks in the lower class with the psychology of consumerism and indoctrinating them with the ideology of individualism. We've spoken at length about individualism and why this white ruling elite class continue to promote that ideology, because while the rest of us are competing with each other as individuals, they are collectively coalescing, right? Their resources, and they're operating as a team. They're operating as syndicates to rob, loot, and mug lower classes of people. But the ideology of consumerism is what pumps the economic surplus from black communities and lower class communities, right? And feed them into these white elite banks, corps, right? And into their pockets. And so again, it's beneficial, it's economically beneficial for all other classes of people to act as individuals as well as economic consumers. According to Dr. Wilson, consumerism is defined as the tendency to treat consumption and accumulation of goods and services as a central purpose of life. We believe that if we buy like them, right, if we buy as many goods as the white rich elite, that somehow we can join that class. Somehow we'll become as socially mobile as them. Wilson goes on to argue that consumers caught up in or carried away by the unrelenting struggle for survival or insatiable status-striving drives, communal and social goals receive little consideration and low priority. Dr. Wilson argues that the ideological individualism with which black and lower class America is indoctrinated by the white ruling elite, an ideology which does not apply to itself, is designed to automatize those collective groups into aggregations and individuals, each of whom is almost exclusively concerned with his or her private or personal interests in life, in opposition to the collective social interests and the life of the group as a whole. If the current white ruling elite can turn the black community into a bunch of individuals, then they can aggregate. They can generalize with specificity. They can predict how much money black folks are going to spend at the end of 2022, 2023. If they can turn us into a bunch of individual consumers, then they can predict how much money economically we are going to spend. If they can socialize us as individual consumers of their political ideologies, then they can predict which political candidates we are going to vote for. So the white collective consciousness is not just developed by osmosis around the dinner table or solely at white racist Klan rallies, but through their educational establishments, through their social clubs, through their ideologies of consumerism and individualism. They're able to develop this collective consciousness. Well, Black family, I want to thank you for joining for this lecture for Chapter 7. Our next lecture is going to be in Chapter 8. I look forward to joining you there. We are discussing Dr. Amos Wilson's A Blueprint for Black Power. And I look forward to your time and your engagement then. Peace, peace, family.